instruction. I don't try to think about it. I just do what I'm told.
It's actually why I just kind of told you.
I can be thoughtful about a lot of things.
Oh, that's
Technology is
We're up.
not one of them.
We're up.
What? We're up? No, we aren't. Oh, now we are. Okay. Welcome to Ambrose University this evening. I want to apologize first for the confusion we had getting started last evening. We're all learning what it means to have effective virtual gatherings, but I also want to say how grateful I am to the IT staff here at Ambrose who were able to fix the problems so that we were able to proceed at all last weekend. I want to begin by respectfully acknowledging that Ambrose University is situated on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. These people were here before us, and we are grateful that they share this land with us. My name is Joanne Badley, and I'm Dean of Theology. On behalf of the university, and especially the Faculty of Theology, I'm happy to welcome you to the second of this year's Downey Lectures. Every year, the Faculty of Theology hosts the Downey Lectures, a lecture series endowed by the family and friends of Dr. Murray Downey, a longtime teacher at Canadian Bible College, a predecessor of our school. Dr. Downey taught theology, scripture, and evangelism for over 30 years, starting in 1941. We are delighted that part of his legacy to the school is this annual lectureship. The Downey Lectures are an opportunity to bring highly regarded theologians and biblical scholars to Ambrose, this year only sort of. And I'm sure you will agree that we have brought in, again, a really helpful and provocative scholar. Next year, around this time in October, we will have a pastoral theologian, so watch our website for details. This evening, I want to welcome again Dr. Nijay Gupta, a New Testament scholar who is passionate about academic work that also serves pastors and the church. Dr. Gupta received his doctorate from the University of Durham, and he has written and edited several books, many of them on the writings of the Apostle Paul. One of his latest books is Paul and the Language of Faith, which he said last night prompted the historical research, which is the foundation of the lectures he's giving this year at Ambrose. He's also written many articles published in various academic journals and is active on social media. He teaches at Northern Seminary in Illinois, but lives in Portland, Oregon. Now that's a commute. He's a foodie and a coffee snob, which I don't know if you could live in Portland and not be either of those. And he and his wife have 3 children. His lecture this evening has the very interesting title, Cult Without Smoke and Blood, the Strange Worship of the First Christians. Our format for this evening is fairly simple. In a moment, Dr. Gupta will present his lecture, and after the lecture, I will turn to Dr. Stovall, Old Testament professor here at Ambrose, who's going to respond to the lecture. And then we'll have time for questions from the audience, which I will moderate. So I ask you to put your questions into the chat function, and I will hopefully be able to manage that much technology. So please join me now in warmly welcoming Dr. Gupta. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Badley and Dr. Stovall. I really appreciate it. We had a really good time last night, and we had a great conversation. We wish it could go longer, but you know, people have to go to bed, and so it's great to have another night to talk and share. And I appreciate the both of you and also the rest of the Ambrose community and other people that are participating tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, so bear with me a second. All right. Tonight we're going to talk about worship. Just to start the evening with a light mood, I want to share one of my favorite Christian memes. You may have read this before, but the little desk counter said, "If thou shalt worship me, I shall be thine," from Luke chapter 4. And if you know where it's from, this is actually spoken by the devil. I could just imagine some poor soul out there reading this and saying, yes, master. Okay, but seriously, what are the connotations you have with this word worship? For me, it's music, singing together, getting into the mood of connecting with God, being drawn into the presence of God, to be wrapped in his love and the glorious mystery of his numinous presence. Something like that, right? Well, you might be surprised to know, actually, by now, if you've been listening to my lecture, you'll probably not be surprised to know that that would have been utter folly to the average Greek or Roman. It is precisely that kind of spiritual ecstasy and flippant boundary breaking that incurs the wrath of the gods. First things first, though, what is worship? There are a couple of false leads that you may have been taught. For instance, that the English word worship comes from the Saxon worthskype, to proclaim worth. Okay, that's pretty generic. We can do better. Or maybe you impress your friends at a party by saying that the Greek word for worship means to kiss or to blow a kiss. Etymologies are fun, but useless. There are no obvious links to kissing of any kind, certainly not in the first century. So please, please, please stop saying that. The gesture most commonly associated with worship in the Bible and other ancient literature is kneeling or prostrating oneself as a visible sign of lowness before someone of great authority or power. We think of this in terms of gods and religion, but this kind of activity would have been very common in many social and political contexts, similarly to bowing in Asian cultures. Let's take a quick case study to help orient ourselves. You know the old story of the adoration of the Magi. We definitely recall that they gave gifts, but do you remember that they fell down before the child? And there are lots of questions we have that are not answered in this short story. Did they worship the baby Jesus as a god? Matthew doesn't say that, so is worship the right word for it here? Were they revering him as some kind of divine king? Maybe. They did have that kind of thing back then. Why worship a baby who won't remember their homage when he's grown? So why bother? Or did they know he was powerful enough to overthrow Rome? He was not their king, after all. We often assume that the Magi were worshiping Jesus as a god, right? But we find a similar situation in Genesis when the brothers of Joseph go to Egypt to get in his good graces, and they, quote, present him with gifts and revere him with their faces on the ground. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word used here for revering him is the typical word for worship. But clearly Joseph wasn't a god. So what were these brothers up to? Worship is about power. It's about recognizing and reinforcing a hierarchy of power in the world. Let's quickly do a little bit of a Greek study to better understand the words for worship. First and most prominently, you have the Greek word proskuneo, the most common word for worship, and it means to pay respect to or revere. You also have very commonly the Greek verb latruo, where we get the word liturgical, comes kind of similarly from this word, and implies worshiping through cultic activity like sacrifice. You have sebomai, which would be the most popular word for worship in pagan literature, Greek literature, but it's pretty parallel to the usage of proskuneo. And finally, you have douo, which is not especially a religious word. It just means to submit to or serve, as in serve as a slave. But this was used sometimes for serving deities. What these terms have in common is the sense of recognizing a superior or authority above oneself, just as the Magi's did, just as did the brothers of Joseph. You see, the ancient world was highly stratified with clear levels of authority and power. On the human plane, you have slaves at the bottom, moving up to elites and senators. But beyond that, there is the emperor, lower beings of the divine realm, and then the top dogs. And at the very top, you have Jupiter. Everybody owes reverence or homage to somebody except the person at the top, like Jupiter, best and greatest. so the Romans thought. So what? So worship is not clapping and singing. It's not making an emotional connection. It's not choosing the right hymns to match the mood and theme of the sermon. According to most cultures throughout history, including Greeks, Romans, and even Jews, worship is, number one, reinforcement of the political structure of the cosmos. Number two, appeasement of an offering to the divine. And number three, an activity of fostering a relationship of reciprocity and exchange with the divine. Have I made this all sound like business and politics? Does it sound dull and boring? Welcome to ancient religion. Ancient Greek poet Hesiod said, for example, and I'm paraphrasing him, you worship the gods so they may be generous to you, such that you may buy someone else's homestead and he may not buy yours. Worship is business. Do what you need to do to get the job done. Oops, sorry. Okay, so worship is business. And in this business, what is the currency? The currency is smoke and blood. Material, especially animal sacrifice. Ancient worship had a smell. It was thick, gory, and gloomy. We look back at animal sacrifice cultures, and yes, there are some today as well, and we might look back with a little bit of distaste and disgust. But material sacrifice has a long and distinguished history in Israel as well. Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann refers to sacrifice as the materiality of worship. It was the physical expression of honoring God. Much the same for Romans. Famed historian Mary Beard says, quote, sacrifice was the closest thing the Roman world had to a creed in action. The imperial calendar, for example, revolved around many holy days and festivals, each one with its expected offerings. You made sacrifices too at parties, work events, and during war campaigns. You had material offerings at home, honoring the household deities during things like births, coming of age ceremonies, and funerals. More fire, more smoke, more ash, and often more blood. Try to imagine this. At the dedication of the first Jerusalem temple, Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats. Similarly, when the Roman Emperor Caligula was coronated, there was an offering of 160,000 cows over 3 months. That's around 2,000 cows a day. And also keep in mind, we're talking 2 gallons of blood per cow. Where does all that blood go? In a satirical statement about Emperor Marcus Aurelius, we read about some animals begging for their lives, knowing they might be slaughtered during yet another military parade for Caesar. And so these bulls say, we white bulls salute you, Marcus Caesar, another such victory, and we are undone. So why then? Why all the smoke and blood? The short answer is we don't know. Suffice it to say here, conventional wisdom points to 2 reasons for sacrifice as a central cultic activity in ancient religion. Number 1, material sacrifice involved gift giving towards the end of goodwill and return to the deity. The Romans had a clever little motto, do ut des, I give to you so that you will give to me. Much like another Latinism we know, quid pro quo. Although how the gods actually received the gifts was unclear and occasionally parodied. Sometimes an offering was completely expended or burned up, and perhaps then was whole in the divine realm, but often the suppliants or priests themselves consumed the gifts. In a Plauntine tale called The Pot of Gold, a shrewd slave cleverly exclaims, I'll use my own glass here, I will offer you, goddess Fides, a whole vessel full of honeyed wine as a sacrifice. That is what I will do, but then I will drink it myself. That's just water, by the way. Material sacrifice opened up, this is the second dimension, Material sacrifice opened up a line of communication between the mortal and the god. It was the quarter in the payphone that initiates the call. That's the theory of classic scholar F.S. Neiden in his book, Smoke Signals for the Gods. Sacrifice was communication, smoke signals or Morse code, grabbing the attention of the divine. But the sacrifice just opens up the line and doesn't force the god's hand. They're open to accept or reject the suppliant's request. This reminds me, and I think that Dr. Stovall really likes this part. This reminds me of Rubeus Hagrid's introduction of the hippogriff, Buckbeak, in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Hagrid was teaching the Hogwarts students about magical creatures. A brave soul might try to ride the majestic part eagle, part horse creature called a hippogriff. But one must treat them with respect to earn that privilege. Hagrid teaches Harry the proper bow and approach to honor the majestic beast. A wrong move, a distasteful gesture could lead to offense. As Hagrid warns, easily offended hippogriffs are. Don't never insult one, because it might be the last thing you do. What can we say then about Greco-Roman sacrifice? It was the most common expression of piety and respect for the gods in the world of the first Christians. Everyone gave gifts to the gods all of the time for corporate and personal reasons. Sacrifices could be celebratory, apologetic, or a gift in hopes of later goodwill and return. Smoke and blood. That is how you paid respect to the gods. It was a method that goes back to the beginning of human civilization. It's etched into all the greatest legends and folktales. Everyone does it no matter the god. It's simply a fact of life, except the Christians. Yes, Jews broke some of these rules. They refused to use cult statues and they would not worship the Roman gods. But they cut a deal and said they would ask their one God to bless the Roman Empire. Sacrifices happened regularly in the one Jewish temple, and Romans appreciated the industry and majesty of their massive temple. And if you remember yesterday, I referred to the Jerusalem temple as the Euro Disney of the Roman world. What about Christians? So they simply did not have the fabric of worship. No temples, no priests, no sacrifices, no blood, no ash, no smoke. Mary Beard says to reject sacrifice as the Christians did was tantamount to rejecting traditional Roman religion. Now, when Beard says they rejected sacrifice, she probably is imagining the Christian church of the late 1st and early 2nd century, the real emergence of this group as a widespread recognized religion. In the decades just after the death and resurrection of Jesus, we can assume that Jesus' followers like Peter and Paul continued with the general practices of the Jerusalem temple as they were processing their new allegiance to Jesus. And the Jerusalem temple had sacrifices in accordance with Jewish covenantal law. But a century later, Christians like Justin Martyr were publicly defending their strange and dangerous non-practice of blood and material sacrifice. In his famous apology, Justin writes this: "This is the only accusation you make against us, that we do not worship the same gods as you, and do not offer to the dead libations and the savor of fat, crowns for the tombs and sacrifices. And yet you know very well that the same animals are considered by some of the gods, some to be gods, by others to be wild beasts, and by others to be sacrificial victims." Justin also claims, "We are not atheists worshiping as we do the maker of this universe and declaring as we have been taught that he has no need of streams of blood." The first apostles, like Paul, had not worked out an anti-sacrifice theology in the way that Justin did a few generations later. But it does appear to be true that the early Christians did not view the Jerusalem temple as the axis mundi, the center of the universe. Rather, with the indwelling of the Spirit, holiness could be anywhere and everywhere. Thus, Paul could refer to church bodies and human bodies as temples of the Holy Spirit. When it comes to sacrifice, clearly the Christians saw the death of Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice, as in Romans, quote, he was given over because of our transgressions. I don't think we can say Paul worked out a neat and tidy atonement theology in his letters, even though scholars have tried to squeeze that out of his letters. But we do get a clear picture of a once for all kind of statement in chapter 5 of Romans. Quote, we have now been declared righteous by his blood. We will be saved through him from God's wrath. All of those things that sacrifices did in the ancient world, these are no longer necessary because of Jesus, so the Christians claimed. We introduced a theory earlier about sacrifices opening up a channel of communication with the gods like Morse code or smoke signals. Clearly, for the Christians, Jesus did this par excellence. If we know anything about the theology of the first Christians, it was that they believed they lived in Christ and that somehow too Christ was in them. Sacred space followed them around like the dust cloud around Peanut's pig pen. Okay, that I admit that's a weird analogy, but I still like it. The Christians believed holiness stuck to them like dirt, which is ironic. That didn't mean they were perfect or even godlike, but simply that God was always with them. This was such a strange idea if you think about it. And Paul is at pains to explain this concept to many of the new converts that he interacted with, such as the reveling Corinthians. He writes to them, it really matters, Corinthian brothers, when you have sex with a prostitute. Christ is with you. You are united to the Lord, one with him in spirit, as he says in 1 Corinthians 6. So what you do with your bodies matters. You have company always. The Christians introduced the world to what I would consider a religious technology revolution. Before, if you wanted to communicate with a god, you had to go somewhere special, a sacred grove, oracle, altar, temple, statue. Sure, you could pray anywhere and everywhere, but you couldn't really be sure that your message was going to get through. You had to find a spiritual hotspot. But the Christians, you see, had this crazy idea that you can connect anywhere at any time. Telephones, as you know, came into existence in the late 19th century and became a common household installation by the 1930s. For 50 years or so, telephones dominated human communication as it does now. But you had to find a place to make a phone call. This struck me as I was recently binge watching to be exact, Stranger Things, set in the early 1980s. The main characters often find themselves in danger, and my natural instinct is to yell, call the police. But they can't just pull out a cell phone. They can't ask Siri, hey, Google, Alexa, call 911. Communication was localized in the 1980s. Physical lines connect devices like house phones and payphones. But in the late 1980s and into the 90s, we saw the rapid rise of cell phone technology. Instant communication wherever you are. We take it for granted now, but this would have been mind-blowing to your great-grandparents. I hope this analogy was worth the rabbit trail. So how did this work for the Christians? At the risk of pushing the phone imagery too far, we can say that the Spirit plays the role of generating the signal, both the phone's input and output waves, and the signals of the satellites and towers. And Christ in this case then would be the operator, interceding on our behalf, as Paul says in Romans 8. The bottom line is this: the early Christians took engagement with the divine out of the traditional realm of altar and sacrifice. One of the main strategies for reimagining this was the Christian use of family language. God is everywhere called Father by the Christians. Christ is called Son. Believers relate to one another as brothers and sisters, and they all live in a massive household of faith, as Paul says in Galatians 6. So just as in the home, if you want to talk to Father, you talk to Father. Yes, you need to show respect. Yes, he's an authority over you, but he also loves you and wants to embrace you and care for you like the compassionate Father of the prodigal son. You don't need to make a sacrifice to connect with your Father. That would require, by the way, a lot of cleaning. If you have the right relationship, son or daughter, you are family and you have direct and unlimited access. Now, I want to be clear that the Christians were not against ritual. When I say that the Christians did not have sacrifice, I'm not saying that they were Gnostic or only lived in their heads. They had their own rituals, but obligatory rituals of appeasement or to initiate exchange, the Christians had no use for these. Their rituals reinforce a personal relationship similar to bonds of family and friendship. Okay, I want to take a pit stop here and revisit the meaning of worship. If you were wanting to study the concept of worship in early Christianity, you might go to a library and do a word search for book titles. Much of what you would find on early Christian worship would come from the middle of the 20th century from scholars like Oscar Kuhlmann, Ralph Martin, and Paul Bradshaw. That brand of scholarship had a major methodological flaw, and that's why you don't see it anymore. It used modern categories of worship and then tried to trace them back to their earliest layers. We would say that their approaches were anachronistic. So the main categories they used for worship were sacraments, music and liturgy, and confessions. But the early Christians did not treat communication as a substitute for sacrifice. Sorry, they didn't treat communion, like the Eucharist, as a substitute for sacrifice. It was a memorial and it was fully consumed, nothing left at the altar, so to speak. As for music, we've made far too much of looking for early Christian hymns in Philippians 1 or Philippians 2 or Colossians 1, and then assuming they were sung. The same go for confessions. Yes, Christians cherished their beliefs and did verbalize them, but it is not clear to me that this counted as their worship, not in any more particular way than other things counted as worship. All these things, rituals, songs, confessions, these are all little pieces that help to fill in the puzzle of early Christian worship. But I think it's important to start the puzzle with the biggest and most shape-making pieces. Instead of presenting the worship of the first Christians as a certain set of practices, I think it's better to talk about three major foundational concepts of worship. First and foremost, the first Christians viewed worship as slavery to God. Slavery is bad. We all know that. Some of the Romans knew that. Christians probably knew that as well, but it did supply a powerful image for worship. If the prevailing notion amongst the Romans was that worship was humble gift giving in hopes of exchange, the Christians knew better. God is creator and we are creatures. We are not clients or customers. Christians took seriously the claim that God is kurios, Lord, and thus we are douloi, slaves. Slaves don't look for benefits or quid pro quo. Slaves serve at the pleasure of the master. This was fueled by that anytime, anywhere conception of the presence of God. If God is with us always, which can be a good thing, we are always at his service. Hence, the apostles calling themselves slaves of God, even slaves of Jesus Christ. I wonder if the apostles found inspiration for this or a precedent in the story from the Old Testament of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel. In view of the command to worship the image of Nebuchadnezzar, they held their ground and were thrown into the furnace and survived. They saw themselves as servants of only one God, and they were, quote, willing to give up their own lives rather than serve or worship any other God. Daniel 3:28. Still, slavery sounds pretty bad. Nobody wants to sign up for that. But here we have a God known for love and who loves to treat his people as family. A second key piece of the puzzle is this: worship as imitation of God. We might be used to or very comfortable with talking about imitating God or becoming like Christ as a normal part of Christian formation. But in the ancient world, this was very dangerous thinking. In fact, the whole point of worship was to remind ourselves we are not gods, that we're just humble mortals. Greeks and Romans did not use the language of growth or formation for piety. Religion was about making peace with the gods, keeping the gods happy. Now, there were some philosophers who did scoff at the moral neutrality of common worship practices in the Roman world. Take, for example, Roman Emperor and Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius. In his work called Communings with Himself, Aurelius addresses the thoughtless prayers of the people. This man prays, "How may I sleep with a woman?" You should pray, "How may I not desire to sleep with that woman?" Another prays, "How may I be rid of that man?" You should pray, "How may I not wish to be rid of him?" Another prays, "How may I not lose my child?" And you should pray, "How may I not be afraid of losing him?" Turn your prayers round in this way and observe what happens. So Aurelius says. Sounds kind of Christian, also sounds kind of Buddhist. But in any case, as impressive as this is, Aurelius seems to have been a solo voice fighting against a popular stream. For example, when everyday people consulted oracles, like the Oracle of Delphi, we have records of the kinds of things that were on their minds. It was not, "How can I be a better person?" I found a really interesting list of typical prayers and requests, and they're related to travel and safety, relationships and love, work and prosperity, health and illness, and victory in sports and war. This could be 2020. One of my favorite requests from an oracle, which was preserved from Greek antiquity, is from a certain Agus who asks Zeus, Naios, and Dione about his blankets and pillows. Are they stolen, or have I lost them? Aurelius is right. No one was asking, "How can I be a better person? How can I do right in the world?" Jews did have a moral foundation to their religion, and they were commanded, "I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy." But this gets much more emphasis and direct reference in the New Testament. Paul talks about imitation of God and imitation of Christ. Part of the energy behind this is the earthly life and ministry of their patron deity, Jesus Christ. The Christians could point to a person and say, "I'm trying to be like him," which reminds me a lot of that wonderful ad from my youth, "Be like Mike." Worshiping God, honoring God, took shape in living like Jesus Christ, imitating him. And imitation is the highest form of respect, right? Here's a fun illustration from the Old Testament. Moses is sometimes depicted in art as having horns, as with Michelangelo's famous statue. Why? Some ancient versions of Exodus 34 say that he came down from Mount Sinai with horns. Later on, we realize the Hebrew word could be taken in two ways: beams of light or horns. It makes more sense that it's beams of light, thus he wore a veil, and so our translations say that beams of light came from his face. But one scholar, Greg Beale, argues that this might be wordplay. While the Israelites were at the bottom of the mountain worshiping a golden calf with horns, Moses was in the presence of God, observing God's divine light. Moses was becoming like God, shining with divine glory, while the people were becoming dumb like their idol. Thus, Beale says, we might imagine Moses coming down the mountain with ironic horn-shaped rays of light beaming out of his head, serving as the ultimate anti-idol. Okay, so the Christians focused their conception of worship on slavery to God and on imitating God. And now we need a third point to this lecture. The Christians worshiped God by participating in the gospel mission. Rarely does Paul describe himself with common religious language, like that of the Greek or Roman priest. But one place that he does explicitly is in Romans 15. He expresses his ministry as a priestly duty to preach the gospel and deliver to God Gentiles, pagans, as holy offerings made blameless and worthy by the Holy Spirit. Similarly, Paul talks about the financial and material support for his ministry from the Philippians as a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice pleasing to God. This God does not want lamb, grain cakes, wine, vine fruit, something you could buy at the market or temple shop. He wants full participation in his mission to reclaim the whole earth as his own. Indeed, earlier in Philippians, Paul had talked about the persecution and possible deaths of Jesus' followers as worthy sacrifices. Paul's shed blood would be like a wine offering poured out onto the priestly service and sacrifice lifestyle of the Philippians. Romans 12:1 captures this best. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. Historian F.S. Knighton captures Paul's strange statement poignantly. Paul coined phrases a pagan would find self-contradictory, like living sacrifice, a way to describe how worshipers might imitate the sacrifice of Christ through a life of devotion. So we see these three conceptions of Christian worship interact and intersect. Worship as slavery, worship as imitation, and worship as mission. Okay, time to wrap up. What then shall we say about these odd religionists? If there is one obvious thing we learn, it is that they took their religion very seriously, too seriously. They were weird. While the rest of the world wanted to keep the gods quiet and happy, these Christians were turning the world upside down with this idea that the Creator willingly made himself a slave, willingly died a criminal and hung on a cross. This was more than a twist. This was more than cherry Coke. This Jesus thing went too far. This was just plain stupid. Okay, that sounds harsh. Let me explain. I mentioned before that I like Stranger Things. I fall for all the nostalgia throwbacks to the 1980s. So forgive me for trying to educate my children by recently introducing them to Weird Al Yankovic, who seemed far more interesting in 1985. And for today, I'm actually thinking specifically of his hit, which I'm surprised was a hit, Dare to Be Stupid. I'm hoping you'll make the connections to my lectures, but please allow me to read a few lines. It's time to let your babies grow up to be cowboys. It's time to let the bedbugs bite. You better count your chickens before they hatch. You better find yourself an itch to scratch. Talk with your mouth full. Bite the hand that feeds you. Bite off more than you can chew. What can you do? You can turn the other cheek. You can just give up the ship. Settle down, raise a family, join the PTA. Buy some sensible shoes and a Chevrolet. The future's up to you. So what are you going to do? Dare to be stupid. In summary, what might the first Christians say to us today? In view of serving our God like slaves, in view of doing whatever it takes to imitate God in Jesus Christ, in view of full participation in the gospel mission of God, dare to be stupid. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for another challenging and provoking, interesting conversation. And so I turn it over now to Beth Stovell for her response.
Thank you. First, I just want to say thank you, Nijay. That was wonderful. And I think your paper is very engaging and helpful. And I hope that my response will really move in some other directions that just expand where you're going. So I think that in some ways I'm looking at how does this connect to the Hebrew Bible, not surprisingly as an Old Testament person. How does it connect to Judaism? How does it connect to other parts of the New Testament? You really like Paul a lot. How do I agree with your points, but maybe refine a few of them in the process? So the first thing I want to talk about is your discussion about Jewish sacrifice in relationship to Roman sacrifice. And so I really think that one of the things that I think could be helpful, I know this is a big picture kind of talk, but I think that grouping all the Jews together as one kind of Jew is kind of tricky in the first century. And so your discussion of smoke and blood tends to align Jewish sacrifice with Roman sacrifice at several points. And I don't think your purpose is to say they're the same. I think you're showing some overlapping points. But do you link things like Brueggemann's words about sacrifice in the Old Testament with Mary Bird in the Roman context? And so I think that also when you're talking about this and you say we don't really know why material worship through sacrifice is required, you tend to talk about that in terms of really Roman actions of sacrifice. And I kept wondering, okay, so is he saying the same thing about Jewish worship, or is he saying something else? And then you made a comment about Jews cutting a deal with the Romans in which they said they would ask their one God to bless the Roman Empire. But I also think it's important that that's a set of Jews, and there are other Jews doing other things in relationship to Rome. So what I'd say here is, I wonder how this conversation would be changed if you also looked at the place of Jews at Qumran alongside the picture you're painting. While many simple allusions between the sectarianism of Jewish worship in Qumran with Christianity is problematic, it's not the same, obviously. It could nuance your conversation, in part because the way that the Jews at Qumran thought about temple and worship was very different than the way that the Jews who were in the Jerusalem temple thought about that. So I just to give an example, Eyal Regev's article, Community as Temple, and how cultic metaphors worked in Qumran, is an example of thinking about how these metaphors work and then how they're like Paul or how they're like Peter's writings. And so that's one direction I think could help to fill out a little bit of your conversation. Another area where I thought, oh, I love the direction you're going and I'd love for you to go further in some other directions, is basically just because you're a Pauline scholar and I'm a Johannine scholar, so I like talking about John and other parts of the New Testament. And so you tend to, I think quite rightly, build your views of Christian worship on Paul's writings. But when you discuss temple and the role of temple in Christian worship, it seemed really natural to me that John could be a good conversation partner. For one thing, John's depiction of Jesus as the new temple provides one way to discuss the movement we see in Jewish views of the temple as it develops into Christian thinking. Mary Clo's work, Jesus as the New Temple, grounds this perspective within Judaism rather than against it, and sees it as a development of what was already happening in Jewish thought. And I think this could be consistent with how Christianity itself developed as a sect within Judaism. John's gospel also provides us with a way of mapping temple worship as it moves from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And so following kind of in the direction that we see in Greg Beale's book, God Dwells Among Us, and some of his other works on this topic, the idea that we see temple worship as a starting place, then we start to move to a space in the Old Testament where God is viewed as worshipped outside the temple. So for example, God going into exile in the book of Ezekiel. And then we see how John builds on this picture in Ezekiel of God's presence with Jesus as this anointed one whose body is described as a temple. And then John's letters shift this picture of Jesus as the new temple to these anointed ones, the believers, who are also a temple of God. And so it seems to me like that movement from temple worship to God outside the temple to Jesus as temple to believers as temple could actually help with some of the flow of how we get to the views of worship in the way that you described. This also may help us with Paul's descriptions of believers' bodies as living sacrifices in Romans, as you've mentioned, and in 1 Corinthians 6. And while I think you rightly link Jesus' blood and body to this understanding and the value of the body, I think the conception of Jesus' body as a temple is a natural next step that could be a hinge point in some of this discussion. And I feel a little strange if I try to agree with your statement that the early Christians took engagement with the divine out of the traditional realm of altar and sacrifice. So I would adjust this statement by saying they took engagement with the divine out of the literal spaces of altar and sacrifice by redefining spiritually these very ideas. And they do that by way of Jesus and the Spirit among the people. And so to me, the key difference is this. Your approach seems to point to the loss of altar and sacrificial language. And somewhere in the paper, it actually comes back to it. But it's just very interesting to me because I actually think that what we're doing is actually reconceptualizing altar and sacrifice rather than losing them. And this explains how we get really blatant language throughout the New Testament, besides in Paul. You mentioned some examples in Paul, actually, but we also see that in the book of Hebrews, for example. So you've got Hebrews 10 completely laden with altar sacrifice imagery. And in this passage in Hebrews 10, it explains that sacrifices are no longer necessary. But the reason given is not because they no longer conceived of it as important, but rather proper worship is now through the greatest sacrifice who is placed on the greatest altar. Jesus, who is priest, sacrifice, and he's altar all at once. So always kind of a moment where you're like, okay, he's doing lots of things, but they're all important things. So Similarly, as we think about how is sacrificial language connected to other kinds of language, I think it's important to ask the question whether it's really as simple as dividing sacrificial language separate from family language. So one of the things that you do is suggest that Christianity shifts from the sacrificial language to family language, so father, son, brother, sister, and that shows a relational focus. So I don't disagree with the notion that there's a relational focus in Christianity, but I'm not sure that this sets it against sacrificial language. And so here's how I might respond to that. So it made me think about how in the Hebrew Bible, as we study the Akedah, the famous story of Isaac's binding, where he's being taken up as a potential sacrifice by Abraham, how that's connected to child sacrifice in the ancient world. And one of the key notions that many scholars point to is that in Abraham's interaction with Isaac at this moment, in this time period with him, as he's preparing for the sacrifice, in that moment, Abraham expects God to give another sacrifice in place. And we see an anticipation in general for this other kind of sacrifice, even going all the way back to these early stories. Many scholars, and particularly Jewish scholars, have linked the development of the Levites, who are devoted to God, and the sacrificial language associated with them as a replacement of the notion of child sacrifice. And they cite Numbers 3 as an example of this. So going back to my questions about metaphors of family, metaphors of sacrifice, if child sacrifice is replaced with a sacrificial figure who's a priest, this could actually explain what we see in Hebrews and what we see in other parts of the New Testament. The dynamics bring together family metaphors and sacrificial ones. So the son is sacrificed by way of devotion to God and serves the purpose of a sacrificial surrender. Jesus is this notable son, but this son is given by God. The son who is given as a sacrifice for many, Jesus as the son who is also the temple, the altar, the sacrifice, the priest. So if this perspective is true, then sonship and family metaphors aren't at odds with sacrifice metaphors, but instead they're blended. And Jesus' death is the sacrifice of a son devoted to the Father, who is the priest of all priests, the sacrifice of all sacrifices, and this is because he's the son of all sons. So to my fourth and last point, your discussion of the key points of Christian worship were incredibly interesting. I was really fascinated with those 3 points that you brought up. And I want to just engage 2 of them and really setting a lot on the point 2. So in point 2, you said a second key piece of the puzzle is this: worship is imitation of God. And here you mentioned Leviticus, I think that's a natural link. I think it could be interesting for you to explore notions of being made in God's image and how that's connected to worship as imaging God. At least one of the notions historically of how to interpret the Imago Dei, this image of God in Genesis 1, focuses on the idea of human beings as representations of the king, of the great king, standing in God's place as the great king wherever they are. And this notion of image bearing brings new perspectives on how worship imitates God. So being emissaries for the great king tends to do that. So if I'm an emissary for the great king, I'm imitating God. That's my role. And this leads to discussions about how we're part of God's kingdom come here on earth through this worship by imitation. Here I will somewhat sheepishly journey into your territory as a Pauline scholar. I don't consider myself a Pauline scholar. I hang out more with prophets and some John, but I am actually working on a project on God's spirit and presence throughout the New Testament, which obviously includes Paul. I think that Paul's discussion on God's image and glory in 2 Corinthians 3 could really add to your discussion of worship as imitation of God. In 2 Corinthians 3, we see encounter with God compared to a new experience of God's presence that takes Moses' encounter a step further. The experience of God's presence comes with God's glory for Moses, but the experience for Moses is transitory. We see it in the pillar of the fire and cloud, this manifestation of God's presence. It comes to the people in the wilderness, but also departs whenever God pleases. And it perhaps then is not the case that Paul's contrasting Spirit versus Moses' experience, but focusing on a continued and permanent experience of the Spirit and God's presence of glory in this new post-Christ resurrection experience of Christians. So if Paul is building on these experiences of Moses for his understanding of Christian encounter with God, this could add to your discussion of Christian worship. 2 Corinthians 3 builds on notions of being God's image bearers when we have the Spirit's presence. And that presence brings freedom and transforms us into the Lord's image. To quote 2 Corinthians 3, 17 to 18, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So I want to say to you, Nijay, yes, a wholehearted yes. Worship is imitation of God. But I want to add this. Worship is imitation of God by bearing God's image and being steadily and continually transformed into God's image by contemplation of the Lord's glory, his divine presence among us through the Spirit in us. This experience of transformation is the momentum that moves us into God's mission, which is, as you pointed out, the act of God's worship. And this transformation equips Christians to do the work of God without being overwhelmed. I find it interesting, the relationship between God's presence and glory and that language of image in 2 Corinthians 3, which we've just been talking about, and how this manifests in 2 Corinthians 4 in living out God's gospel mission, which I love that those 2 points that you have are actually set up in 2 Corinthians 3 and then in 4. Christians are transformed towards God's image, and they're emboldened to press on through difficult spaces of mission, remembering that we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all surpassing power is from God and not from us. 2 Corinthians 4:7. So some conclusions. I don't think my 4 points really take away from your arguments. I hope they add to them. My hope is that they spark new avenues to enrich what you're already doing. And so avenues to think about diversity in Judaism in the first century. How does that connect with Christian worship? Avenues to think about developments in conceptions of the temple in the first century, which could help with the discussions about temple worship or the lack thereof. Suggesting ways that family language and sacrificial language could work together and really help to explain the consistent language of sacrifice in Christianity without the literal smoke and blood, as you've described it. And finally, by suggesting another avenue, even within Paul's writings, to explore this relationship between worship as imitation of God and how that connects to image bearing with worship, Christian worship that participates in God's mission. And so thank you for that.
Thank you, Beth. And now we give you some minutes to reply to Beth's comments.
Sure. Thank you, Beth. And, she sent me this earlier, so I had a chance to look it over and think about it a bit. So if it seems like I have these brilliantly crafted, responses on the spot, she did give me a little bit of time to work on that. Both your comments and Ryan's from last night have been really helpful, and it's helpful for you to know. I think one of the challenges that I think both of you experienced, Ryan also, is the way I'm talking about Christianity, Judaism, Romans, Greeks, I'm taking basically what's called an etic perspective. So, anthropologists use the language of etic versus emic. And an emic perspective is the perspective of an insider to that group. And so if I'm painting with these broad brushstrokes, combining Jews and Romans and Greeks, it's because I'm doing this purposely kind of from the blimp perspective, etic kind of thing. And, so I'm not really getting into the nitty gritty of kind of what we call theology. I'm trying to do a little bit more of a I think of Robert Wilkins' famous book, As the Romans Saw Them, Christians as the Romans Saw Them. And then there's been some kind of spin-offs of that, like Jews as the Romans Saw Them. And so I agree that if you were to ask a Jewish person about their, religio, they're going to talk about it differently than I'm talking about it. But you did mention in your response the concern about transactionalistic approaches for Jews. And I agree with you that Jews did not see their worship as exchange in the formal sense of I give you this sacrifice and you don't give me wrath. I agree. If that's the way we're using the language of transaction, then obviously that's not what Jews thought. And maybe that's not even what Romans thought, even though that's how I'm describing them. But you take someone like Ed Sanders, who really shied away from using the language theology, and he used the patterns of religion. And I kind of like that in order to get ourselves out of philosophizing and theologizing everything. And he came up with this phrase, which covenantal nomism. And if you're understanding what Ed Sanders means when he uses that, he is talking about a reciprocity relationship, right? One is saved by grace, so to speak, gets in by grace, but then stays in by nomism, by law obedience. There's some measure of reciprocity there. And what's really interesting is this conversation has continued to unfold over the years about how to explain the covenantal dynamic. And I've been following some conversations in Josephine studies. And Paul Spilsbury, for example, says Josephus takes a little bit different direction with this. And he actually tries to portray the covenant relationship not as covenantal nomism, like Sanders says, but as covenantal patronage. He uses patronage, Roman patronage, as the kind of structure or model for the divine human relationship. And that kind of model is a reciprocity model. So I wouldn't use the word transaction, but a kind of exchange model. If we're looking at kind of a very basic level, then I think that something like that is going on with sacrifice, even amongst Jews. Now, you mentioned Qumran, and I agree that I'm just referring to Jews. And as you know, this is normal. I'm referring to Romans, I'm referring to Greeks, I'm referring to Christians. There are probably many different kinds of Christians. So, I'm doing kind of broad brushstrokes. But I will say that some scholars think that there were animal sacrifices in Qumran, even if the Qumranists rejected the Jerusalem temple. There's some debate. DeVoe says no, Magnus says yes. And in terms of centrality of sacrifice, a good text to think about this is Tobit, because you have these people in Assyrian exile, and they're not by their temple, and Tobit has to go around and bury dead bodies of his fellow Israelites / Jews, and it makes him impure, and he has no easy way of becoming ritually pure, which is one of the reasons that he laments his situation. I guess all I want to do by putting Jews on the Roman side of the equation is to say that if a Roman was going around checking off on a checklist to see if a certain person is being respectful to the gods, they would be looking for sacrifice, and the Jews were doing it. And I think about like when Amazon said they're going to have grocery stores. They haven't done this, I don't think, but when they have grocery stores where there are no cashiers. Have you heard about this, where you just go into the store and you put into your pocket or into your bag all the groceries and you leave, and on your way out, your body gets scanned for all the items. And so this idea that we're not going to use a cashier lane, we already have self-checkout, but the idea that we're not even going to use the lane anymore, my camera's getting blurry here. That's an innovation, and it would strike us as really strange. You could tweak the system all you want, but once you take that whole thing away, life becomes very different. And I think that is a kind of Herculean leap that the Christians take. I agree with a lot of your comments from then on in terms of temple and using John. I think for me, and I'm thinking out loud, so tell me what you think about this, Beth, but if you want to try to figure out what the regular Christian thought about what they were doing, I struggle to appeal to Hebrews or John because they're so philosophically oriented. It's like when people say, oh, we can represent Jews using Philo. You can't. Philo is so weird and he's so philosophical. And many people compare Hebrews to Philo, and they obviously compare Hebrews to possibly an author as Apollos, who was an Alexandrian philosopher. So I think Paul, even though he's brilliant and he's the first and greatest theologian, et cetera, he gives us something closer to what I think is a lower view in terms of simplicity of what Christians may have thought about what they were doing. I could be wrong about that. And he has some very deep parts, as 2 Peter says. But I struggle to think that Hebrews is going to capture what an average Christian would have thought about their own philosophy of Christianity. And same thing with John. I mean, both these texts are written later on the first century, and I don't have any problem using them as scripture. But okay, I'll stop there. But I agree with a lot of what you've done in 2 Corinthians 3. I think of the work of Carmen Imes on image bearing. I think of the work of Haley Jacob at Whitworth, who's done work on glory and image bearing in Romans. Ben Blackwell has done some of this. So there's some really interesting stuff being done. I'm trying to stop short of doing too much theology. It sounds terrible because everything I'm doing is theology, because I wanted to create as simplistic of an approach as I could. Because if you ask today in our churches, what's going on during worship, right? Most people don't know. In the same way they can't answer the question, what is the Trinity, right? A few of us eggheads with PhDs can come up with some kind of cool answer, but your average person couldn't. So I tried to bring it as low as possible to kind of a common Christianity in the same way I did with common Judaism. That has its drawbacks, but that's the approach I took here.
Thank you, Nijay.
Thank you to both of you. And just to say, there's quite an active chat line here. And I have several questions I'd like to bring from the people that have been listening and to your exchange. First of all, Natalie asks a question which I think is quite related to the conversation you've just had. She asks, from the Romans' perspective, the Christians' worship as imitation would have been weird and dangerous. But did Christians see themselves as dispelling the hierarchy of sacrificial system? In other words, was there, is my interpretation, did they see themselves as actively responding to that cultural milieu in which they found themselves?
That's a really good question. There's a really lively conversation, New Testament scholarship about this. In what kind of circumstances would Christians actually get in trouble? And so, for example, Christians weren't going to the Oracle of Delphi. That's okay, right? Nobody's really going to notice that. You had a household cult, the Lares and the Penates, and Christians didn't do that either, and that was okay because no one really saw them not doing it. But let's say the emperor comes into town, which is pretty rare, just like we don't see Air Force One flying over Portland very often. Let's say the emperor comes to town, and the whole city is met to go out, greet him, and make sacrifices. And if there is a Christian presence there and they're not doing anything that day, like they're sitting at home, that could be a problem. That could really get them into trouble. And so there are questions about when Paul says, you've turned away from idols to serve the living and true God, 1 Thessalonians 1, 9 and 10. Is that the kind of thing that's going to get them in big trouble? And I think about things like, for example, when I visit relatives in India, and, if I go there and they have a shrine in the room I'm staying in, or if they give me food that has been literally, from a Hindu temple used in religious services, what do? I think Christians had to navigate that awkwardly the same way we do today, where we'd have to say, I'm going to pretend to eat it, or I'm going to say something, or I have to leave early. I think there are probably different types of people that would handle that differently. I think that the issues that would really get them in trouble would be what we think of as kind of political things. Why aren't you saluting the flag? Why aren't you, it would be those kinds of things that would get the most attention. And yeah, that would get them in trouble. But because we don't hear about a lot of this in the representative literature from that time, we don't get the sense that this happened very often, at least not in the first 5, 6, 7 centuries of Christianity. Decades of Christianity.
Thank you. Another question from the chat stream. Brian Gilroy asks, is the argument for a weird Christianity the same if the original disciples were Messianic Jews and the Christians were Gentile?
Beth, are you understanding this question better than I am?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm going to try and speak for Brian, but I think one of the things I pointed out in interacting with you is the distinction, strong distinction between Christians and Jews as like sort of two categories. If you say, okay, well, what if we're seeing really like Jews who come to receive the Messiah as a part of what Christianity is? Would that change how we talk about
I
what
see.
counts?
Yes.
And you know, and we also have alongside that we have Gentiles who are Christians, but we
Yes,
do
yes.
have a real group of Jews who still see themselves as Jewish who are now also Christian. So I think that's where Brian's question is coming from.
I see. Okay. This is perfect because I had a quote I wanted to read that I forgot to read, so this might fit in. So I found this really interesting essay by John Barclay, who was one of my professors at Durham. And he wrote an article not that long ago called Jews and Christians in the Eyes of Roman Authors around 100 CE. And this is a book called Jews and Christians in the First and Second Centuries. So this is really interesting. Barclay says that the earliest pagan writers talking about Christians and talking about Jews doesn't connect them. And so I'm going to read the quote, but this is Barclay's view, and he's, you know, the leading historian on this kind of in the world. But he says, a common picture emerges. Judeans, like Egyptians, Syrians, Gauls, and other foreign nations, are mappable as an ethnic group with a homeland and a history, and a set of particular ethnic customs, attractive to some, ludicrous to others, and distinctive religious rites, which can be categorized negatively as superstition, like other non-Romans. Christ followers, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, are not marked on this map. Were they simply invisible, too small or insignificant to notice, or were they just indistinguishable from larger entities? Pliny knows the Essenes only because of his account of the geography of Judea. There are no other indications of subgroups among Jews, although Juvenal is aware of their spread across social strata. Did any of these authors know about Christians, but regard them as a species of Jews? Nothing they say about Jews would give a hint of this direction. So, so that kind of reinforces what I'm saying in terms of we as Christians will make a connection between Jews and Christians because of the scriptures and because of the origins. But an outsider, according to Barclay, and I agree with this, they're not going to make that connection. Because in the ancient world, by and large, you couldn't tell what ethnicity someone was by just looking at them. I mean, you could to some degree, but you weren't going to just jump right into that when talking to somebody. So, I would say that made them, that Christians, drastically different in the sense that, like Barclay says, they weren't mappable. So I don't know how to answer that question, but I hope that quote would clarify where I'm coming from.
Thank you. I have a question. In fact, first, two questions in a row from John Coots, who's one of our theologians here at the school. John says, in the light of the theme of strangeness, I wonder how we tell whether the Christians were doing the strange thing or whether we have stranged the Christian practices by missing the original context.
Yeah, that sounds like a philosopher's question there. So bravo. I will say this, and you know, I would be open to either of you answering as well. But I did want to mention, I forgot to say this, strangeness is a category of the outsider, right? Because nobody thinks themselves they're doing something strange. It is it is an assumption of abnormality. And so when I say it's strange, and in my lectures I keep saying, you know, nobody believes this. Who would, you know, I'm appealing to kind of regular Joe or Jane in the ancient world. Did such a thing exist? I think so. You know, the kind of, you know, popcorn eating, movie going population, you know, in the equivalent in the ancient world. I think you'd have that person. And I think, you know, you would toe a certain line and you would conform to a certain broader standard. And so when we say they're strange, you know, each of us knows what it's like to do something awkward socially, like yelling at the customer service person in the store, you know, or, you know, making a scene somewhere. We know what that's like. And so to the question of looking back on it as strange, or perhaps we're not truly understanding where it comes from, I guess one way to answer that question is to say, how strange did they feel themselves? did they feel the strangeness themselves compared to the wider culture? And I would say it would feel to me like it would be a yes, pretty big time, because as I had said, you're moving the center of religion away from sacred spaces, traditional sacred spaces, into houses. And it wasn't sacred houses, they're just any houses. And there's been some study by like Edward Adams, for example, that they met outside or in shops. They just met anywhere, which would seem as strange as us having, a lecture, in a garage. That would just seem strange. It's the wrong place, right? And so I don't know how to answer John's question in terms of maybe we're not fully understanding. I think they would, let me give an example. Several years ago, my wife's grandmother, we took her out for coffee, and we took her to a coffee shop to just sit and talk. And this seemed like the most bizarre behavior to her. She was like 90 something. And we're sitting in this coffee shop, drinking coffee and just talking for like an hour and a half. And she looks around, she says, "This is weird. I've never done this before." And it's just completely out of her conception of normal, but it's so normal to us. Mm-hmm. And I think the Christians were constantly experiencing that. And I think we touched on this yesterday. Were some of them attracted to it because of that, the strangeness? That's possible.
Maybe the second part of John's question strengthens or pushes the conversation. He says, for example, the idea of imitating Jesus. What if that's our later invention or emphasis, when in fact early Christians would have been more at home in their time on that point? In other words, is that imitation would have had a less strange idea, would be a less strange idea.
I'll say a word, and Beth looks like she has her thinking cap on, so she can say something too. But I'll let Beth talk about Jews, but I'll say from a Roman and Greek perspective, the idea of imitating a god would seem like you're very much stepping out of your appropriate place. Now, of course, Cicero and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius have these ideas because they're philosophers. But your average person wouldn't really think of that, because that's not really the territory. That's a moral category. And you don't really put the gods into those categories. The gods are like your boss at work. And if you flip burgers or whatever, you're really not trying to be like your boss, unless you really want to be middle management at McDonald's. But, it's a job, and you just want to respect your boss and go home and, hang out with your buddies. And so I would think for Greeks and Romans, this wasn't really in the ballpark of what they were thinking about. So it would be strange, but it's obviously different for Jews. I'll let Beth say something about that.
Yeah, I think Judaism has an interesting tension throughout it as you think about sort of the history of what does it mean to be like God. There's a strong tension in two directions, right? So being holy like God is holy. So that's a over and over again. A holiness code in Leviticus is full of that. So in the sense that Jews are to follow the holiness of God and be like God in that way, imitation of God would have been continuity with the New Testament and with Christianity, right? That continuous call to holiness, the continuous call to be like, to be imitators. So imitating Jesus as an extension of imitating God. But I also think you have to put right alongside that the very strong sense of God being other and more and transcendent that's also so important. There's lots of engagements throughout the Old Testament that clarify that we are not God, and to act like we are is a problem. And so the line of imitation, I think there's aspects, but I really think that the New Testament takes some of that in just a new direction. And so there's elements of continuity, but I also think you're right in seeing discontinuity between those things, as I think per usual, as we think about how Judaism develops into Christianity. So.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is I don't see imitation language in the Old Testament as much as the theme that's very similar of following, right? This kind of two ways motif. there's the ways of the world or the idols and the ways of God, and following this journey motif, just like with, the wandering in the desert, that comes pretty close to imitation. It's more about obedience than it is imitation, but it's imitation in the sense that he's going ahead of them. So you're kind of walking in the footsteps.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think one of the number one metaphors we get all over in terms of what life looks like and what does it mean to follow God is the metaphor of the way, like what is walking, journeying.
That's right.
But I think you also do get image language alongside that. And I think the image language is maybe closer to imitatio, like the idea of imitation, in terms of like how the language would translate from a Hebrew idea to a Greek one. But that's a whole other can of worms probably. So
sure.
Another question that's on the feed here is to ask about the very earliest times of Christian practice. So when Jews became Christians but still participated in synagogue sacrifice, how do you think they imagined that? Did they think they were offering sacrifices to Jesus, or did they keep their Christian world separate? How did that work?
Oof, I like to Beth weigh in on this one because I'd love to know what she knows. But I will first of all say we're talking about temple worship, not synagogue. I don't think we have clear evidence that sacrifices were done in synagogues, because synagogues were a lot like schools and houses, and they weren't. I don't know if they were ever described as sacred space. I'd have to do some more research on that. But to answer the question about the temple, yes, they did participate in the temple. What did they think about it? Unfortunately, we don't know. This is sometimes called the tunnel period, where you have like 30 to 50, 30 CE to 50. We don't really know what they thought. Paul would be our best witness for the earliest strands, and he doesn't really say. I think they would be acknowledging that the temple was a special, especially holy place. God can't fit into, a small temple. He can't even fit into the world, but somehow this place is special. I don't think they saw it as sacrifices to Jesus, because the early Christians were so clear about Jesus being the pathway or the means to communing with God. I think they continue to recognize Jesus himself was that living sacrifice, or was that, like I keep talking about, that communication channel. I think they viewed himself as that, that intermediary, right? The great vicar. So I don't think they ever thought in those, especially in those early years, about sacrifices being to Jesus. There's a great book by James D.G. Dunn called "Did the First Christians Worship Jesus?" And Dunn actually answers no. I actually think based on the whole book, his answer really is maybe. But one thing he really, really interestingly argues is that in the New Testament, almost never is Jesus the object of worship. He's the means of worshiping the one God. And having spent a lot of time in the New Testament since reading his book, the pieces keep coming together that he's onto something there. Jesus is almost never the object of worship. But yet, as you use him as the mediation or means of worshiping, you're obviously passing through Jesus, right? So that might help answer that question. But I'm curious what Beth thinks about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think just thinking about what we get as the most common prepositions in relationship to Christ, right? It's often in and through Christ is the language we get more commonly than what we do to Christ. So, and I think in terms of worship, I mean, one of the things that the language that's most frequent is how we live and move in Christ. And I think in the Spirit as well is kind of the language. And so I think that, well, you're right. We have a gap in that space and time where we're not actually quite sure how they were interacting in the temple. That's part of the discussion around, well, at what stage did it completely move to a vision of the body of Christ as temple and the community as temple? When did that happen is one of the big discussions. Part of the reason that that's a discussion has to do with the dating of John, actually, because that's where a lot of that theology comes from. Earlier dating of John that we over time have become more and more historically believing that it's a little bit earlier than it was originally dated would actually maybe push that a little bit. But I do think you're right. I think Jesus as means for worship is much more what you get in much of the language rather than to. Although I will say, and I keep thinking of like, at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow, right? So there are places where certainly, particularly the name of Jesus becomes something that is worshipped. So I mean, it's not completely out of the question that they would praise the name of Jesus. That definitely seems like something that's part of it, but I'm not sure we have evidence that would tell us what they were doing. So
That's true.
Although I would just want to throw in some of the Revelation texts. Like I think it's pretty clear in there that what we have is the worship of Jesus. Somebody like Larry Hurtado would argue pretty hard and long that that was part of a fairly early Christian liturgical practice. Seems to me. Another question from the feed. It says Christians were weird in light of practice or lack thereof of sacrifice. Nevertheless, sacrifice is very much alive in their belief of Jesus as the ultimate Paschal Lamb. So does the above statement get lost in translation for the Romans? Like that how do we understand then the statement understanding Jesus as the Paschal Lamb? At least that's how I would understand this question.
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, just I'll try to answer it, but just to kind of reiterate, I'm working on more of an outsider perspective. So this is without sitting down and like interviewing Christians. But I don't know exactly why, but I feel like the evidence from Paul points to the fact that there was no clear singular theology of atonement or sacrifice that was communicated in those first several decades. And so if you asked, just like if you asked a Christian today, why do you do X, Y, Z in your church? They'll say, just what we do, why do you have sermons? Oh, I don't know. We've always had sermons. So I think it's probably like that in terms of, Paschal, Passover stuff. Paul is pretty inconsistent in the way he talks about the relationship between Christ and sacrifice. Enough to give us pause about kind of making that the kind of central way of looking at cult. And really quick, that brings me back to Beth's question about, when I said that Paul replaces sacrifice with family language. You got spot on that I wasn't saying he got rid of the language. He obviously didn't. And you're on much better footing by saying they're blending. But just the basic idea that they didn't have material sacrifice was just all in and of itself extremely innovative. As far as we know, these Christians in the 50s, 60s were the only people in the known world that didn't purchase and give material sacrifices. Now, maybe at the temple, so let's say it's 75, right? They were the only people in the known world. I mean, that is pretty weird. And that's kind of what I'm pointing to, regardless of whatever theology they had. I think we make a lot of assumptions about an early Christian having a theology, as if they read a systematic theology book or they're getting really deep, catechesis. Paul was preaching all over the place, and there were believers all over the place. But the idea of any kind of systematic teaching of Christian theology, you're not really going to get that until much, much later.
I was just going to engage in the whole Paschal Lamb language because really what's really interesting is if you are right, which I think you are, that we don't actually have smoke and blood, right? That the Christians, that's one of the things that makes them unique. Then having someone like John the Baptist get up and say about Jesus, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. It's a very interesting, provocative language if you're not sacrificing lambs, right? So actually using this sacrificial language, in a sense, when you're not doing the literal material work, it actually heightens, I think, those images. And so it heightens it and it makes it focus on Jesus in a certain kind of way, the identity of Jesus and who he is and what he does in a way that I find really fascinating. And I think, to your comments about Revelation, we see the lamb who was slain as what basically makes the ability to open the scrolls, like in Revelation 3. And that sense of the slain lamb identified in certain kinds of ways, again, in a time period where it seems like they're not doing these sacrifices. And yet that sacrificial way of thinking just flows into their identity mapping for Jesus. And this is fascinating, I think. So I like that it makes them especially weird. And maybe even weirder, I wonder if the fact that they use the language but don't have the blood makes them weirder than if they just stopped using the language entirely, and also didn't do the material sacrifice. I don't know. I think that's interesting.
Well, let me give an example. This is kind of funny, and you'll understand this if you have young kids. But there's a Coldplay song where some of the lyrics is, I'm feeling drunk and high. It just says it over and over again, feeling drunk and high, and it's basically on love. And I remember getting scolded by somebody for singing that with my kids in the car, because I'm singing about being drunk and high, even though I don't get drunk and high, literally, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember, I think it may have been my wife, but I don't want to throw her under the bus. But but I remember, saying, well, actually, Paul talks about getting drunk on the Holy Spirit, even though these people aren't getting drunk anymore, hopefully, And so it is kind of some of that where there's enough familiarity in society with these things. They don't need to be necessarily doing them, but they realize how common they are.
Great. I'm going to take chair's prerogative here and bring you back to some of your very opening questions about the difference between what you see in the New Testament in terms of their understanding of worship. And I just acknowledge that, yes, maybe it's very strange for their time. So then where does that leave us in the 21st century when, to be honest, our worship would be also basically not recognizable either by first century people, or in some cases, I would suggest, by 21st century people. It's like how do we begin to bring this insight of your research into a context where it starts to make a difference in terms of the way we frame our understanding and perhaps even grow in our practice of worship?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we talked a little bit about this last night, so I'm going to mention that as kind of a springboard. So we talked about, are there practices from the ancient world that we should have today? Mm-hmm. And I said no, because the Christians were really not as far as I could tell, they weren't as concerned with the specific rituals done in specific ways, in the ways that Romans are, as much as using rituals to reinforce those kind of main ideas. Do this in remembrance of me. Romans didn't really have that idea that, just as Paul says, you have to, when you eat and drink, do it with a good conscience, right? They didn't really have that idea in the Roman world of making sure your heart was in the right place, so to speak. But what I said last night, which I will say again today, is I don't think Paul or the first Christians would be so concerned that we get the rituals right. Or especially not that we do them exactly the same way they did it back then, even though there's nothing wrong with that, as much as that we're using our rituals, and we should be using rituals, but that we're using our rituals to reinforce those three concepts of worship as slavery, worship as imitation, worship as mission. And so what I would love is if we kind of did a reset for some of our churches and said, okay, what if we start with this conception of worship, and then we build rituals that are parallel to baptism, communion, all the foot washing, fasting, but that resonate with our culture. Because foot washing, we talked about this last night, foot washing was so common in the Roman world, but it's not common today in our society. What would be the equivalents of humble service and, things like that get there? I remember as a teenager going to a youth ministry conference, and we wanted to do communion together as a youth group, and we didn't have any elements. And some traditions will despise what we did, but we went to a 7-Eleven and we got basically crackers and Kool-Aid. And we just did that, as the elements there. We were in some beautiful place like Sedona or something. And, we commune together. We remember the Lord Jesus. And, some people say you have to have this, you have to have that. I don't think actually Paul points in any way to that kind of thing. I think he's really concerned. So to answer your question, I would love that we stop copying what we've done before just because it quote unquote works, or just because our grandparents did it. I don't have any problem with singing songs, but for example, I'd love to know what a deaf community does for worship. And I would love if we just said for the next 3 months, we're going to stop singing. We're not going to use singing at all, because we've become so obsessed with treating singing as checking the box off of worship. I think it's really atrophied our ability to actually rethink what worship actually is. And I think we need to find fresh ways of rethinking what we think. And I'm a big fan of not even using the terms. Like for a while, we're not going to use the word worship. What other terms can we come up with? And I think this freshens and brings new health to our faith. Martin Luther did this when he translated the Bible into German. He was translating the word ecclesia, church, and he could have translated as Kirche, which is their word for church, but instead he chose Gemeinde because he didn't want them to associate ecclesia with Kirche. He wanted them to associate with community. Because he wanted to kind of hit a reset button on the ways we think about the ways that we worship. And I think that was what I would love to see churches do, to be weird. Here in Portland, people don't want to go to church. The unchurched don't want to go to church because of the baggage from their grandparents or whoever. So a lot of churches don't call themselves churches. This is the Gathering, this is the Groves, this is the Mosaic. I'm okay with that, even though there's some good things about connecting to the church, the word church. I'm okay with rethinking some of this because none of this is necessary in the Christian tradition. What's necessary are just the things that we've been talking about as part of the foundation of worship.
Thank you. That seems like a very appropriate place to end. So let me just say that we say again, thank you for being willing to come and to offer from your gifts and studies. And also thank you to Beth for being willing to respond in such a careful way. And I'm really grateful for the work that you both do. And I just ask in closing blessing on both of your work. Thank you again for being willing to come to us in this somewhat exceptional kind of circumstances. And I'm grateful that we could make it work this evening. So blessings on all of you as you go from this place. May you love and serve the Lord as we go out into the world. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you to the both of you. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Yeah. So,
Steve is turning off.
okay, Steve.